Welcome to Inside Marketing with MarketSurge, your front row seat to the boldest ideas and smartest strategies in the marketing game. Your host is Reed Hansen, Chief Growth Officer at MarketSurge.
Hello and welcome back to Inside Marketing with MarketSurge. I'm your host, Reed Hansen, and today we're talking about something that's often overlooked in the age of hustle and automation, the art of communication, etiquette, and storytelling, and how mastering these can elevate your business, your personal brand, and your career. My guest today is Nisha Trivedi, one of the top-ranked MBA admissions consultants at MBA Mission, and also a LinkedIn learning author and a business etiquette thought leader who's helping professionals and organizations communicate with more clarity, civility, and confidence. She's been featured in outlets like Poets Quants, Bloomberg, and the Los Angeles Times, and she trains leaders to navigate modern business interactions with grace and authenticity. We're going to talk about how brand etiquette meets storytelling and what great brands and people have in common when it comes to earning trust. Let's dive right in. Thanks so much for joining, Nisha.
Of course, Reed. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and just by way of background, Nisha and I, a while ago, we were classmates at Ross School of Business. So it was so fun to reconnect. I've been an admirer of Nisha's videos and content that she posts on LinkedIn. I think she's done a tremendous job with her own personal brand. So I thought she'd be a great advocate for this audience. But let's talk a little specifically about your own career arc. You've helped a lot of professionals, hundreds perhaps, craft their personal stories for top MBA programs and other high-level careers. Tell us a little bit about how one defines a personal brand, what makes somebody really authentic.
Sure. So I think what defines a personal brand is it really boils down to the essence of who are you, right? And so what are your motivators? What have been the experiences that have shaped your life? What are your passions? What are your key drivers? And so when I encourage people to think about their personal brand, it's not so much from the standpoint of, form a brand the way that a product has a brand, but it's really figuring out, what's the essence of who you are. And of course, who you're not, because I think an important part of branding in general is figuring out, what you don't do or what doesn't appeal to you.
Okay. Well, fantastic. So, often in the coaching and consulting profession, the brand takes on an extraordinary value, and it's like a constant piece of currency that a consultant needs to develop. Talk a little bit about how you did this for yourself. Like, you weren't always a coach. You worked in industry and consulting before. How did you take that experience and craft a brand to transition into coach and consultant?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of what even brought me to the space. So before we went to business school, Reed, as you might remember, I was doing marketing research type of roles, let's say. And I think what that did for me is it planted the seed of really understanding people deeply, their drivers and their motivations and their preferences. And then went into business school thinking, okay, I'm going to do brand management, right? So I'm going to take the consumer insights and apply it to marketing programs, and specifically for consumer packaged goods, because I have a passion for food and beverage. And, I did do that for several years. And then, as things were changing from a career and company standpoint, let's say, I was looking for my next opportunity. I was trying to figure out what direction I wanted my career to head in. And, my first instinct was, okay, let's look at other marketing roles within consumer packaged goods, maybe in technology, maybe in other industries. And the more I started searching, the more I really started by asking myself, what even drives me into this line of work? And I realized it really truly was the people aspect. And so then I'm thinking, well, do I go back into marketing research or, how do I indulge that? And then I also started thinking about how can I use the skills that I enjoy using the most, or I've enjoyed using the most throughout different parts of my career, which are, writing, which are speaking, which are, being a go-to person for a particular subject, which is something I've enjoyed at each of my roles. How can I make sure that whatever job I do, I get to apply that? And so that's actually what brought me into coaching in the first place. And so at MBA Mission, what attracted me about MBA admissions consulting, when I was in the search process, that I remembered, really getting into a flow in my own application process in terms of becoming comfortable crafting my story and really drawing a connection between myself and the program and my goals and the motivation behind my goals, which a lot of people mentored me on as well. And so, I really took a leap of faith years ago, it was a big switch. And so it definitely took time to build my brand. So I was definitely not getting a lot of clients right away. I had to prove
Right.
that, no, really, this is something I can do. And so it took time. And I think that any switch, and then particularly a switch where somebody has to really put their faith in you to guide them, I think that's something that took time, but it was about really working hard, working with different types of clients, and then kind of slowly building up the successes and just as importantly, the confidence to keep moving forward.
So, and I do have to say, one of the things that I've noticed is, that you're a very confident speaker. You're good on camera, and obviously you've been doing this a lot, and a lot of the content you share is in video form. How did you build that confidence, or how do you come off with that presence? What have you trained yourself to do? What do you focus on?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I focus on building a connection with my audience. Luckily, I've never been put off by public speaking. It is something that I've enjoyed. Video, the one challenge I found at the beginning was, we're all our own worst critics. So I would see a recording of myself and think, no, I don't want to see this. So I think trying to get over that and saying, look, we are all our worst critics, which is something that someone told me recently. And so kind of getting over that piece. And then even just understanding different platforms, right? So something I started doing more recently is posting videos on LinkedIn. I figure, posts, regular written posts, which I had done as well. There's just so many of them. So how can I be even more relatable, or how can I kind of cut through the noise, and how can I deliver the information in a more, digestible soundbite than, let's say a lengthy post. And that's something that I've really enjoyed as well.
Fantastic. Well, I know a part of your coaching in whether it's in, we'll get to the business etiquette, which I think is an interesting topic, but we'll get to that in a second. But in admissions consulting for MBA programs, a big part of what you do is storytelling, helping individuals develop stories. Why is storytelling so important? And what's a rough process that we could learn from to build our own stories when we're explaining ourselves and our brand?
Sure. So I think storytelling is important because it really gives the other person a window into who you are, which is why it's so important to be authentic when you're telling your story. And the way I coach my MBA application clients is first we do a deep brainstorming so I can even understand who they are in the first place, right? Even anything from their family life to their personal passions to the activities they've been involved in, and of course their professional path so far and what motivates their goals and even the reasons for pursuing the degree in the first place. So once I understand that, I can help them figure out, okay, based on all of this information, how can you present it to the admissions committee in a way that's authentic? That you're not trying to appear in a certain way, right? Or come off in a certain direction, but you're really telling them, no, this is who I am. And of course, the MBA applications, as we've both seen, they ask different types of essay questions. Some are professional, some are personal, some are kind of a hybrid of both. And so we figure out together, based on your various stories, the experiences you've gone through, the lessons you've learned, how do we present each application so that it shows a portfolio of your experience and so that it's really written in your voice, right? I coach them, I give them suggestions, but at the end of the day, the best essays are those that really it's the applicant in paper form. Like it is them. You could practically hear their voice when they're reading it. And so I think that's the power of authentic storytelling. And it helps the reader understand their experiences, what they've learned, the positive impact they've made, and what motivates them going forward.
Something I've wondered about, I obviously went through the MBA admissions cycle, and, I did it without a consultant. So I don't claim that I had a great application or anything, but, I got into the school I wanted to, and I was super happy about it. But the balance between authenticity and like creating a story that impresses or really motivates or persuades, how do you ride that? Because authenticity, people like to hear a little bit of weakness or a little bit of like,
Yes.
I made a mistake and learned from this. But how do you balance authenticity with needing to persuade and inspire?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. I'm glad you brought up, something about, and not showing yourself as completely perfect and infallible. I think that's a really big part of it. I think that the first thing is I always encourage MBA applicants to really think about, obviously they want to present themselves in a positive light, but they can't ask themselves, how can I impress the reader? Because if they're asking that, they're asking the wrong question, right?
Right.
It's about how can I really help them understand who I am and what I have to offer so that they can see why I'm seeking a place in the class and why I'd be able to contribute just as much as I can. So I think that's really more if they're not looking out to impress, but it's more looking to see, I want to give the reader the maximum chances to understand me and why this makes sense for me. I think that works a lot better. And I think that, vulnerability can be a really powerful tool in some of these essays, right? Sometimes it's more explicit, right? Like in a MBA interview, they'll ask, what's the time that you made a mistake? And, what did you learn from it? Or what's something that you're working on? So maybe a piece of feedback you're working on addressing. And then, of course, you want to be candid. You don't want to bring up red flags, but you want to be candid about, hey, I'm not perfect at anything. Here's something I'm working on. I've improved, but I'm still watching out for it, right? That's definitely something that the schools explicitly want to hear about. But even in essays that don't necessarily ask for it, like let's say there's an essay that's asking you to write about a leadership experience you've had. Maybe it's a success story, but does that mean it was just smooth sailing the whole way? I mean, probably not, right? Let's be honest. So I always tell people, if there's some challenges you ran into, if there's any resistance you encountered, if you really had to get people on board when they were kind of reluctant at first, those are the types of things to bring in. Or if maybe something just didn't go your way at first and you had to course correct, that makes for a much richer story. And it shows, that you are this authentic person. You're not a person who's putting on airs. You're saying, hey, you know what? I'm not perfect. This went well, but I learned some things along the way as well. And it's important for you to give credit where it's due, right? Rarely is anything a singular effort.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Tying back to your experience in marketing research and industry in general, have you encountered many like business leaders that have done a good job with storytelling, balancing vulnerability and being able to really inspire? Have you encountered any examples that come to mind of that's like in the outside of the MBA admissions world, but like kind of in real life doing this, what you described?
Yeah, I would say, well, outside of, if it's okay if I just go outside of the
Yeah,
business world for a second,
please.
there's a podcast that I started not long ago called A Slight Change in Plans by Dr. Maya Shankar. She's a cognitive neuroscientist, but she is amazing. And each of her episodes, some of them are prominent individuals, others are more, let's say, everyday. And they've each gone through an experience in life where there was some sort of curveball of some kind.
Yeah.
Maybe it was medical, maybe it was something in their career, maybe it was, there's a lot of examples. And just how did they, you know, really handle that sort of dynamic. And I feel like the storytelling aspect of that is just really powerful, right? I think hearing other people's experiences can be really inspiring and can be eye-opening. And she herself peppers in her own experiences in those episodes. So I think anytime I get to hear other people's stories, and I think again, that's probably what attracts me so much to working in admissions consulting. I get to learn about all these backgrounds. I think listening to a podcast like that or reading people's memoirs really the best ones that I've read they're not smooth sailing. There are all sorts of things, some big, really big curveballs, or even just like day-to-day mishaps that made me think, they're so successful, but they're not perfect either. We're not alone in
Yeah.
our, in our shortcomings.
Yeah, I love it. I really like this topic. I got into reading when I was riding the train commuting into the city. I was reading quite a bit just to kind of block out the long commute. And so I was thinking about stories quite a bit. And my commuting days are over for now, but I try to read when I can. But I find that storytelling is a part of like almost every aspect of our life, like the people that impact us. You said outside of the business world, of course, and whether it's, but we remember people that are able to both be vulnerable and inspire and convey a message. And yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I think over time, I've found that some of the best stories are those that don't follow that clean arc, that have like, little progress, little setback, little progress, setback, and maybe don't
Exactly.
have a happy ending.
Because there isn't always one. That's true.
Right. Well, I'd like to talk about the other kind of consulting you do, business etiquette. Tell us a little bit about how you got into this. Do you offer etiquette consulting for business leaders? How did that come to be? And how did you get interested in the topic of etiquette in the
Sure.
professional space?
So what I should first just go way back, to even earlier when I was, let's say, a kid or a teen. I love reading advice columns, of all types. I think Ann Landers, there was some medical advice column in her newspaper. I read that, all these things. And then Emily Post, which I'll get into very soon. I think they had advice columns as well on how to deal with business etiquette situations, or just, I should say, no, etiquette situations. Even things like, how do I set the table properly for a formal dinner? I always found that all very interesting. And then, years later, when I got to the workforce, I always was very interested, even more than I was ever interested in the business problems, really, the marketing, let's say, dilemmas, the people dynamics that I saw, the team, my dynamic between me and my managers, the team in general, things I'd heard about politics, behaviors in the workplace I saw that were positive, some maybe not so much. That was always just very interesting to me. And especially things were exacerbated. I noticed when there was, let's say, a reorganization or some sort of takeover, or, we've all seen so many of those, right? But that's when the really interesting stuff comes out. And then after we graduated from business school, and of course, during business school, I should say, we had those management and organization classes that, warned us like, hey, the people stuff is going to be even harder than the business stuff, right? And then once, got back into the workforce, I would realize, I would talk to, let's say some work classmates who might have had this experience, how's that job? The one that you spent all that time recruiting for and spent 2 years in business school. It's like, I would hear things like, oh, it's great, but, my team and I don't always get along, or it's going well, but, my manager is like X, Y, and Z, or, hey, there's been a reorg and things have just been really strange since, or this person, has been, their behavior in meetings has been really bothering me. And I would realize that all of these things have such an impact on our day-to-day lives at work, and all the people stuff basically, and the dilemmas. And I reflected on some of my own experiences right after business school, which were very, very much the same. And I remember thinking, wouldn't it be ideal if we could all be at our best so that we can really focus on the business stuff and get along so that we can enjoy our jobs better. And so that's just something I was thinking about. And then I actually saw with the Emily Post Institute, I saw some sort of notice, or maybe I was on their email list, and they were having a train the trainer program for people who wanted to become business etiquette trainers. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Let me at least look into this. Did a bunch of research, talked to people at the Emily Post Institute, even talked to people who had already been trainers to see, is this something that I could become interested in? And, made the leap. This was in 2018. And did my first training. I had the opportunity to train with a group of interns right when I finished my training, a lot of luck, and found out how much I enjoy it. And, my full-time role is at MBA Mission. So I don't get a ton of time to do these trainings, but, really it's something that I've really, really enjoyed. And, my mission is to really encourage positive professional behavior, share best practices so that, again, we can be our best selves at work. And then a few years ago, I was approached by somebody at LinkedIn, and they were creating some courses, and they asked me to create a business etiquette course online. Cool. And so then Business Etiquette for the Modern Workplace was born, and I've created a couple courses since then. So that's been an unexpected opportunity that, I really enjoyed.
That's really cool. At a high level, what are some of when you're coming into a new group training or you're working with an individual, what are typically the first or the low-hanging fruit that you approach from an etiquette standpoint, like maybe common failings that people have in this area?
Yeah, I would say some of the most fundamental stuff is, how do we communicate? What are best practices in terms of email? When is it best to send an email? When do you just pick up the phone, right? In the lost art. How do you get to something uncomfortable in a way that, you're, at the end of the day, we can really only control our own behavior, no one else's, but how do you, kind of optimize your response so that you're at least doing your best? So I think communication, making sure you're using the right channel, making sure you're using best practices. It could be something as simple as, don't use all caps in an email, or it could be something like, how do you make sure that you're conveying this information as clearly as possible so that you're not causing all this confusion on the chain? What are some meeting best practices? How do you deal with somebody who's constantly interrupting you? It can be things like that. With new grads, I might even teach, like, what's a good way to introduce yourself? Even like the proper handshake, like that. Although I think, awesome. Sometimes I could use a refresher on that as well, the interns, I think. And then sometimes it's, slightly deeper things. Last year, I did a training for a local business in the Bay Area where there was a lot of interpersonal conflict. And so we talked about how they could, using the principles of business etiquette, make sure that they were bringing issues up and responding in the most optimal way.
Fantastic. Well, this is all super interesting. And I as you talk, I realize like I don't think about how I communicate, and that's probably something I should be thinking more about. And I'm glad there are people like you that are available and that are writing and producing content in this space, because there's just such a wide variance of how people communicate, how people tell stories, or do it well or do it poorly. And I think it's just an area we could really improve. Well, Nisha, like I said, it's so great to talk to you. If people would like to work with you, I think there's several ways they can work with you. There's MBA admission and your business etiquette practice, and I think you would be a great guest and a great follow on LinkedIn. Where can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So for people who are specifically applying to business school or other types of grad schools, I'm again a senior consultant at MBA Mission, and our website is mbamission.com. And you'll see our information there, our bio. There's even a spot to sign up for a free 30-minute meeting, no strings attached, just to talk about you and your candidacy. And then, yes, I do have a passion for, business etiquette, and I conduct business etiquette trainings, individual, group, virtual, in person when that works out. And my website there is ntbus etiquette.com. So ntbuzzetiquette.com, essentially. And that's where I list all the different topics that I can cover as a business etiquette trainer, my bio, just a little bit more about my background, as well as a link to my LinkedIn learning courses. So I have 3 LinkedIn learning courses right now. There's the business etiquette in the modern workplace, which I mentioned. I also have business etiquette for Gen Z, as well as a shorter course on social cues that no one teaches you, which is an interesting topic. And then, of course, I can be, definitely follow me on LinkedIn. It's Nisha Trivedi, just my first and last name. You'll be able to find me there after linkedin.com/in.
Awesome. Well, I'll include all of these in the show notes, so refer to those. But Nisha, thanks so much. This was really interesting, and I'm glad we could reconnect after a few years away from business school.
Yeah, me too. Great to talk to you. Thanks again for having me. Really appreciate it. And best of luck with everything.
Want to stay ahead of what's actually working in marketing right now? Head over to MarketSurge.io and see how we're helping businesses grow smarter, faster, and louder. That's MarketSurge.io, because your next breakthrough shouldn't be a guess.